War veteran's mail-order bride hides tragic secret that could destroy their last chance at love. Have you ever wondered what it was like when the only way to find love across the vast American frontier was through heartfelt letters that took weeks to deliver? When two broken souls scarred by war and loss could find hope in carefully penned words, hit that like button and subscribe to hear this powerful story of healing redemption and the mail-order bride who helped a wounded veteran find peace in the Wyoming wilderness. The letter trembled in Daniel McKay's scarred hands, the neat feminine script blurring as he struggled to focus. 3 months. It had taken 3 months of correspondence to reach this moment, and now that her arrival was imminent, he wondered if he'd made a terrible mistake. Wyoming territory stretched endlessly beyond his cabin. Window, sagebrush, and grassland painted silver under the moon. The isolation that had once brought him peace now felt suffocating. Tomorrow, Margaret O'Brien would arrive from Philadelphia and everything would change. He traced the words of her latest letter, memorized but still compelling. I understand what it means to carry wounds that cannot be seen. Perhaps together we might find a way to bear them. She was a widow, a nurse who'd served in the Union hospitals. She'd seen what war did to men, had held their hands as they died, had pieced together what could be saved. In her letter, she never asked about his injuries directly, but somehow she knew. The way she wrote about patience, about understanding that healing wasn't always about being whole again, told him she knew. Daniel stood, his left leg protesting with the familiar spike of pain that shot from hip to ankle. The Confederate minie-ball had shattered the bone, left him with a permanent limp and scars that mapped a geography of pain across his left side. But those wounds were nothing compared to what he carried inside. The cabin needed no preparation. He'd been cleaning obsessively for a week. 2 rooms and a loft built with his own hands despite his limitations. It wasn't much, but it was solid warm in his. The ranch was small, just enough cattle to get by some horses, chickens. A vegetable garden that he managed to maintain despite the Wyoming weather. It was a life, if a lonely one. He pulled out Margaret's photograph again. Auburn hair pulled back severely, but soft curls escaped around a face that might have been called plain, if not for the extraordinary eyes. Even in the sepia tones, he could sense their depth. She looked directly at the camera, no coy turn of the head or false smile. Her expression was serious, thoughtful, touched with a sadness that matched his own. His own photograph, sent in return, had been carefully staged to hide his scarred left side. He'd told her about the injuries in general terms, but seeing them would be different. The twisted flesh, the way his shoulder sat lower on the left, the slight drag of his foot. Would she recoil? Pretend not to notice while disgust flickered in those serious eyes. Sleep eluded him. He sat by the dying fire, reading through all her letters one more time. The first had been formal, a proper response to his advertisement. Union veteran with ranch seeks companionship and partnership. Must be patient and kind. Her words had been careful testing, but by the 3rd letter, something had shifted. She'd written about a soldier she'd nursed, a boy from Iowa who'd lost both legs. How he'd learned to laugh again when a stray cat adopted him in the hospital. How sometimes healing came from unexpected places. Daniel had written back about the wild Mustang he'd gentled, how trust was built slowly with patience. The correspondence had become his lifeline. Every 2 weeks, the mail rider brought possible redemption in an envelope. Margaret wrote about books she'd read, methods for preserving vegetables, questions about Wyoming weather. But underneath the practical matters ran a deeper current. Loneliness, loss, the struggle to find meaning after everything familiar had been destroyed. She'd been married only 8 months when her husband died at Antietam. She'd volunteered as a nurse the next day, serving through the rest of the war. She never said it directly, but Daniel understood she was running from memories too. Philadelphia held too many ghosts. Dawn came pale and cold. September in Wyoming could go either way, summer's last gasp or winter's first whisper. Daniel dressed in his best clothes, the ones he wore to town twice a year. The jacket hung looser than it had before the war. He'd never regained the weight, the muscle. Chronic pain had a way of eating a man from the inside out. The ride to Laramie took 3 hours. His horse Caesar knew the way, leaving Daniel free to wrestle with his doubts. What kind of man invited a woman to share such isolation? His nearest neighbor was 8 miles away. Town was a half-day's ride. In winter, they might be cut off for weeks at a time. But Margaret knew this. He'd been honest about the isolation, the harsh winters, the simple life. She'd written back, I've had enough of crowds and society. Peace sounds like a gift. Laramie was busy for a Tuesday. The railroad had brought growth, prosperity, and strangers. Daniel preferred the old days when everyone knew everyone, but progress couldn't be stopped. He tied Caesar outside the depot and checked his pocket watch. The train was due in 30 minutes. McKay, Daniel turned to find Tom Harrison, owner of the general store, approaching with his usual broad smile. Heard you got a bride coming in. News travel fast in a small town. She's arriving today. Mail order. Tom's tone held no judgment. It was common enough. The war had left too many women widowed back east, too many men alone out west. We've been corresponding. Well, I hope she's what you're expecting, though in my experience, they never are. Tom clapped him on the shoulder, the good one, thankfully. Bring her by the store. Mary will want to meet her. Not many women out your way. The train whistle sounded in the distance, and Daniel's stomach clenched. He positioned himself on the platform where he could see the passengers disembark but wouldn't be immediately visible. Old habits from the war. Always know your terrain, always have an escape route. The train pulled in with a symphony of steam and squealing brakes. Passengers began to disembark, a family with small children, traveling salesmen, a group of ranch hands. Then a woman in a simple gray traveling dress, carrying a single carpet bag. Margaret. She was smaller than he'd expected, more delicate, but the way she moved, efficient and purposeful, spoke of strength. She stood on the platform looking around with those remarkable eyes. Green, he could see now, like sage after rain. Daniel stepped forward, removing his hat. Mrs. O'Brien, she turned and their eyes met. He saw her take in his appearance, the slight list to his stance, the way he held his left arm closer to his body. But her expression didn't change except for a small smile that softened her serious face. Or McKay, it's good to finally meet you. Her voice was lower than he'd expected, with a slight Irish lilt that hadn't come through in her letters. She extended her hand, and when he took it, her grip was firm, calloused from work. The wagon's this way, he said, suddenly aware of his awkwardness. 3 months of letters hadn't prepared him for the reality of her presence. She followed without complaint as he led her to where he'd left the wagon. He started to help her up, but hesitated, unsure if his bad arm would cooperate. She solved the problem by climbing up herself with practiced ease. I'm quite capable, Mr. McKay. You needn't worry about treating me like China. The ride began in silence. Daniel searched for something to say, but all the words he'd written over months seemed to have deserted him. Margaret sat straight beside him, watching the landscape unfold. It's beautiful, she said finally. Different from your descriptions. Bigger, more empty. It takes getting used to. I imagine most things do. They fell silent again, but it was less awkward now. The road wound through low hills covered in buffalo grass and sage. Antelope watched from a distance, ready to flee. A red-tailed hawk circled overhead. How long since you were back east? Margaret asked. 6 years, left right after the war ended. No family? None left. You. A sister in Boston. We don't speak. She didn't elaborate and Daniel didn't push. Everyone had their reasons for leaving. The cabin appeared as they crested the final hill. Daniel watched Margaret's face as she took it in. It looked even smaller from this angle, dwarfed by the endless sky and rolling plains. It's perfect, she said, and something in her tone made him believe she meant it. He helped her down from the wagon, his hands spanning her waist briefly. She was thin, too thin. They were a pair, both worn down by loss and hardship. Inside, Margaret surveyed the cabin with practical eyes. You've done well with the space. Is that a root cellar? Yes, and there's a spring house out back for keeping things cool. She nodded, already planning. He could see it in the way she measured distances, noted the placement of windows, the efficiency of the stove. Your room is in the loft, Daniel said, gesturing to the ladder. I'll sleep down here by the stove. Margaret turned to face him fully. Mr. McKay, Daniel, I think we should be clear about our arrangement. I didn't come here expecting a love match. I came because your letters showed me a man of integrity who needed a partner. I need a home, a purpose. You need help with the ranch and companionship. We're both old enough to know that practical arrangements can become something more given time and patience. Her directness was refreshing after months of careful letters. I want to be honest with you, Daniel said. My injuries, they're extensive. I have bad days when I can barely walk. The pain, it changes a man. makes him difficult. I've seen what war does to bodies and minds, Daniel. I've held men as they screamed from phantom pains in limbs they no longer had. I've watched them wake from nightmares fighting battles that ended years ago. You don't frighten me. I might disappoint you. We might disappoint each other, but we might also surprise each other. She unpinned her traveling hat, revealing more of the auburn hair he'd only seen in photographs. Now, shall we discuss the practical matters? I assume you'll want to be married soon? This Sunday, if that suits you. The circuit preacher comes through once a month. Sunday's fine. Until then, I'll familiarize myself with the household and start preparing for winter. I noticed your garden needs harvesting. You don't need to start working immediately. You must be tired from the journey. Margaret smiled, the expression transforming her face. Mr. McKay, I've been idle for 3 months while settling my affairs in Philadelphia. Work sounds like a blessing. That evening, they shared their first meal together. Margaret had taken an inventory of his supplies and created something resembling actual food from the salt pork and beans he had been living on. They ate in companionable quiet, both more comfortable with silence than forced conversation. Tell me about the nightmares, Margaret said suddenly, her tone gentle, but matter-of-fact. Daniel's fork stilled. How did you know? You mentioned in your letters that you don't sleep well, and there are certain supplies in your medical kit, laudanum willow bark, that suggest pain management. Men in chronic pain who don't sleep well usually have nightmares. Fredericksburg mostly, sometimes Gettysburg. He set down his fork. I was at Marie's Heights, the stone wall. Margaret nodded. She knew what had happened there. The Union soldiers charging across open ground mowed down in waves. The Confederate forces behind the wall protected, turning the field into a slaughterhouse. I was on the other side of that wall, Daniel said quietly, 20 years old and convinced I was fighting for something noble. By the end of the day, I couldn't see anything noble in what we'd done. Just boys bleeding out in the mud crying for their mothers. Is that where you were wounded? No, that came later at Gettysburg, third day. I was trying to retreat when the shell exploded. Shrapnel tore through my left side. The field surgeon wanted to take the leg, but I wouldn't let him. Probably should have. Margaret reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. You survived. That's what matters. Did I? Sometimes I think the best part of me died on that field. Perhaps, but perhaps something new can grow in its place. That's what I'm hoping for myself. The days before the wedding fell into a rhythm that surprised them both with its ease. Margaret rose before dawn, starting the stove and preparing breakfast, while Daniel tended to the morning chores. His limp was always worse in the mornings, and she noticed without commenting having coffee ready when he returned. She transformed the cabin through small touches. Wildflowers in a mason jar on the table. The windows cleaned until they sparkled. His few books reorganized on a shelf she'd asked him to build. The changes were subtle but profound. The space felt lived in rather than merely occupied. On the third day, Daniel found her in the garden, harvesting the last of the vegetables before the frost came. She'd hiked up her skirts and was kneeling in the dirt, her hands working efficiently among the plants. You don't have to do all this, he said. She sat back on her heels, wiping sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand leaving a smudge of dirt. Daniel, I need to be useful. It's how I cope. He understood. Work was sometimes the only thing that kept the darkness at bay. Your letters mentioned you worked in a hospital in Philadelphia after the war, he said, lowering himself carefully to sit on a nearby stump. 3 years, until they suggested I'd done enough. Truth was, I couldn't face another young man dying from infection or fever. All that suffering, and for what? She pulled a carrot, shaking the dirt from its roots. At least vegetables make sense. You plant them, tend them, harvest them. Simple. Clean. Nothing about life is clean. Cien. No, she agreed. But we can pretend, can't we, for a little while? That evening, she asked to see his injuries. Daniel had been dreading this moment, but her clinical approach made it bearable. She had him sit while she examined the scarring, her touch professional and impersonal. The surgeon did better than most, she observed. The scarring could have been much worse. Do you have full range of motion? He demonstrated, lifting his arm partially. About 60% on a good day. We can work on that. I know exercises that might help. The leg, but he rolled up his trouser leg, revealing the twisted mass of scar tissue that ran from hip to ankle. Margaret studied it without flinching, her fingers gentle as she tested the damaged muscle. You're lucky to have kept it. Most surgeons would have amputated. Lucky? He repeated bitterly. Yes, lucky. Her tone was firm. I've seen men lose limbs for far less damage. You can walk. You can ride. You can work your ranch. That's not nothing, Daniel. She was right, of course. But knowing and feeling were different things. Saturday night, the eve of their wedding, Margaret surprised him by producing a bottle of whiskey from her carpetbag. Medicinal purposes, she said with a small smile, pouring 2 glasses. I thought we should toast our impending union. They sat before the fire, the whiskey warming them from the inside. Margaret had let her hair down to dry after washing it, and the firelight caught the red highlights. She looked younger, softer. Can I ask you something? Daniel said, emboldened by the whiskey. Why did you really answer my advertisement? A woman like you, educated, skilled. You had options. Margaret stared into the fire. After Thomas died, my husband, I threw myself into nursing. It gave me purpose, a reason to get up each day. But after the war, working in the civilian hospital, it wasn't the same. The injuries were mundane, the patients ungrateful. I felt like I was going through motions pretending to be alive. She took another sip. Then I saw your advertisement. Must be patient and kind. Such simple requirements. Not beautiful or young or accomplished, just patient and kind. I thought I can be those things. Maybe that's enough. It's more than enough. Is it, you don't know me, Daniel? Not really. Then tell me. She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then Thomas and I married it quickly before his regiment shipped out. 8 months later, he was dead. But for 6 of those months, I was pregnant. Daniel said nothing, waiting. I lost the baby 2 months after Thomas died. The stress, the grief, the long hours at the hospital. The doctor said any of it could have been the cause. My sister said it was God's will. I haven't spoken to her since. I'm sorry. Don't be, it was a long time ago. But it changed me, Daniel. I can't have children. The doctor was quite clear about that. If you were hoping for sons to help with the ranch, I wasn't. His response was immediate, honest. I can barely take care of myself. The thought of being responsible for children, he shuddered. Good. Then we understand each other. They finished the whiskey in comfortable silence. When Margaret rose to go to her loft, she paused by his chair. Tomorrow we become husband and wife. I want you to know I intend to honor those vows. For better or worse, Daniel. I mean that. Sunday dawned clear and cold. Daniel put on his one good suit, the one he'd worn to muster out of the Confederate Army. It still fit mostly. Margaret appeared in a simple blue dress he hadn't seen before, her hair pinned up elaborately. You look beautiful, he said, meaning it. You clean up well yourself, Mr. McKay. The ride to the small church took 2 hours. A handful of neighbors had gathered more out of curiosity than celebration. The circuit preacher, Reverend Pimmels, was a young man who seemed nervous about performing the ceremony. It was brief, practical, the vows spoken clearly but without romance. When Reverend Mills pronounced them husband and wife, Daniel kissed Margaret briefly, a mere brush of lips that nonetheless sent an unexpected jolt through him. The neighbors had brought food for a small reception. Tom Harrison's wife, Mary, cornered Margaret immediately, peppering her with questions. Margaret handled the interrogation gracefully, revealing little while seeming to share everything. Old Sam Carter, Daniel's nearest neighbor, pulled him aside. She seems solid. She is. Good, you need solid. This land doesn't forgive weakness. As they rode home now as husband and wife, Margaret surprised him by taking his hand. No regrets, she asked. None, you, ask me in a year. That night they maintained their sleeping arrangements. Margaret in the loft, Daniel by the stove. But something had shifted. The cabin felt different with the knowledge that they were bound now legally and morally. Daniel was awakened by his own screaming. The nightmare had been particularly vivid. The boy from Georgia, barely 16, whom Daniel had bayoneted at Gettysburg. The boy's eyes surprised and accusing as the life drained from them. Margaret was there before he fully woke, her hands cool on his fevered face. It's all right, you're safe, you're home. I killed him. He was just a boy and I killed him. I know, I know. She pulled his head against her shoulder and he broke. Years of holding it together, maintaining control, shattered. He sobbed like a child while she held him, her hands stroking his hair. When the storm passed, he pulled away embarrassed. "I'm sorry. Don't ever apologize for this. Not to me." She fetched a cool cloth for his face. "How often do the nightmares come?" "Most nights. Sometimes I can drink enough to keep them away, but that's a dangerous path." "I know." She sat beside him on the narrow cot. "In the hospital, we had men who couldn't sleep without screaming. One of the older nurses taught me something. Would you like to try?" He nodded, desperate for anything that might help. "Lie back. Close your eyes." Her voice took on a soothing rhythm. "Breathe in, slowly counting to 4. Hold for 4. Release for 4. Again." She guided him through the breathing, then began to speak softly about inconsequential things. The garden plans for preserving vegetables, a book she'd read. Her voice became a lifeline, something to focus on besides the memories. He slept, and for the first time in years didn't dream. Winter arrived early that year. By October, snow blanketed the ground, and November brought blizzards that cut them off from town completely. It should have been claustrophobic, two damaged souls trapped in a small cabin. Instead, it became a chrysalis. They developed routines that accommodated both their needs. Margaret needed to be useful, so Daniel found tasks that challenged her. She took over the household accounts, managed their supplies with military precision, and started teaching him the exercises for his damaged arm and leg. "Resistance builds strength," she said, showing him how to use his own body weight to rebuild atrophied muscle. "It will hurt at first. Everything hurts." "Yes, but this hurt has a purpose." The exercises were agony, but gradually, incrementally, he noticed improvement. The range of motion in his arm increased. The leg, while still damaged, grew stronger. In return, Daniel taught Margaret about ranching, how to read weather signs, handle horses, repair tack. She was a quick study, approaching each task with the same focused intensity she brought to everything. Evenings were spent by the fire. Margaret had brought several books in her limited luggage, and they took turns reading aloud. Jane Eyre was her favorite, and Daniel found himself caught up in the story of another plain woman with hidden strength. "Do you think she should have forgiven him?" Margaret asked one night after reading about Rochester's deception. "He lied to her. To protect her, or so he thought." "Lies are lies. They corrode everything they touch." Margaret was quiet then. "We all lie, Daniel. Sometimes to others, always to ourselves. The question is whether we can forgive when the lies are revealed." One December night, a blizzard worse than any before trapped them inside for 3 days. The wind howled like a living thing, snow piling against the windows until they were blocked completely. They had to tunnel out to tend the animals, taking turns, so neither was exposed to the cold too long. On the third night, the storm finally exhausting itself, they sat exhausted before the fire. Margaret had made soup from their dwindling supplies, and they ate in tired silence. "I was terrified," she admitted suddenly. "The storm. I thought it would never end." "They always end." "Do they?" "Sometimes I think we carry our storms inside us forever." Daniel reached across the small space between their chairs, taking her hand. "Maybe, but maybe that's why we need someone else, to remind us that storms pass." She squeezed his hand. "Is that what we are to each other? There are worse things to be." That night, Margaret didn't return to the loft. When Daniel settled onto his cot, she pulled a chair beside him. "You sleep better when I'm here," she said simply. It was true. The nights she'd stayed close after nightmares, he'd slept more peacefully. "Margaret, you don't have to. I want to, if you're amenable." He was. They developed a new arrangement. Margaret would read or knit beside his cot until he slept, her presence a ward against the nightmares. Sometimes she dozed in the chair, and he'd wake to find her there, her face soft in sleep. Spring came late but sudden, the snow melting in a rush that turned the ground to mud and set the streams to rushing. Daniel and Margaret stood on the porch, watching the world transform from white to brown to gradually green. "We survived," Margaret said with wonder. "Did you doubt every day?" She turned to him. "But we did it, together." The shared victory of surviving a Wyoming winter had bonded them in ways their letters and vows hadn't. They moved around each other now with easy familiarity, anticipating needs without words. But with spring came challenges. The ranch needed intensive work after the winter. Fences to repair, cattle to round up, and count horses to break. Daniel pushed himself hard, and Margaret watched with growing concern as he came home each evening, gray with exhaustion and pain. "You're overdoing it," she said one night, massaging liniment into his damaged leg. "The work needs doing. Not all in one day, not at the cost of undoing all the progress you've made." He wanted to argue, but her hands were gentle and sure, and the relief was too profound. "I need to prove I can still do this. Prove to whom? Me, I know what you're capable of. Yourself, Daniel, you have nothing left to prove." "To him," Daniel said quietly. Margaret's hands stilled. "Who?" "My father. He said I was weak for letting the injuries slow me down. Said a real man would push through pain." "Your father is dead, Daniel. His opinion died with him." "Opinions don't die. They burrow into your bones, become part of you." Margaret moved to face him, her green eyes fierce. "Then we dig them out, root by root if necessary." That night, Daniel woke not from nightmares, but from pain. The day's exertions had caught up with him, his legs seized with cramps that made him bite his lip to keep from crying out. But Margaret was there, always somehow aware when he needed her. She worked the cramps out with patient hands, then applied hot compresses until the muscles relaxed. "This has to stop," she said. "You're destroying yourself." "I'm fine." "You're not. And more importantly, you don't have to be. Daniel asking for help isn't weakness. Isn't it? I ask for your help every day. Am I weak?" He couldn't answer that. Margaret asking him to reach high shelves or deal with the heavier chores never seemed weak. It seemed practical. "Tomorrow we go to town," she announced. "We're hiring help for the spring work. We can't afford. We can't afford for you to cripple yourself permanently. I've been going over the books. We have enough saved to hire temporary help. It's an investment in the ranch's future. And yours." He wanted to protest, but the logic was sound, and the relief of not facing another day of agony was overwhelming. They hired Jim Patterson, Tom Harrison's youngest son, for the spring work. He was 17, eager and respectful of Margaret in a way that amused Daniel. "Mrs. McKay, ma'am," Jim would stammer whenever she brought him water or lunch. "Thank you kindly, ma'am." "He acts like I'm his grandmother," Margaret complained to Daniel. "You do have a formidable presence." "Formidable, is that what you call it?" Among other things. Their banter had become easier, tinged with something that might have been flirtation if either had been willing to acknowledge it. With Jim's help, the ranch work became manageable. Daniel could pace himself, focusing on tasks that didn't aggravate his injuries. The improvement in his mood was noticeable. One evening in May, Margaret announced she was planting a larger garden. "Ambitious," Daniel commented, watching her sketch out plans. "Practical. We spend too much on preserved goods from town. With proper planning, we can be largely self-sufficient." "You're starting to sound like a true rancher's wife." She looked up, something unreadable in her expression. "Is that what I am?" The question hung between them. They'd been married 7 months, but the marriage remained unconsummated, undefined beyond the practical partnership they had established. "Margaret," Daniel began, then stopped. What could he say? That he'd begun to watch for her smile, that the sound of her humming while she worked had become essential to his peace, that he was terrified of wanting more than their agreement allowed. "Never mind," she said quickly. "I have seeds to sort." But the tension remained an awareness that grew with each passing day. They were exquisitely careful not to touch unnecessarily, but when they did, hands brushing as they passed, tools shoulders touching as they worked side by side, the contact sparked like static electricity. The crisis came in June. Daniel had gone to check on the cattle in the far pasture when Caesar spooked at a rattlesnake. The horse reared, and Danny, his bad leg failing to grip properly, was thrown. He hit the ground hard, his head striking a rock. When he didn't return by evening, Margaret saddled her mare and went looking. She found him unconscious, blood pooling beneath his head. How she managed to get him onto his horse and back to the cabin, she never could quite explain. Adrenaline, desperation, and sheer will. He was unconscious for 2 days. Margaret never left his side, applying her nursing skills with fierce determination. She cleaned and stitched, the head wound monitored, his breathing dripped water between his lips. When he finally woke, she was asleep in the chair beside him, her hand clasping his. He studied her face marked with exhaustion and worry, and knew with sudden clarity that he loved her. Not the practical partnership love they'd agreed to, but something deeper, more terrifying. "Margaret," he whispered, Her eyes flew open. Daniel, thank God. How do you feel? Like I've been kicked by a mule. What happened? She explained, her voice carefully controlled, but he could hear the emotion underneath. You've been unconscious for 2 days. I thought I was afraid. Hey, he said, squeezing her hand. I'm too stubborn to die. Don't joke. Not about this. Tears were streaming down her face. I can't do this alone, Daniel. I won't survive losing someone else. I won't. He pulled her down until her head rested on his chest, ignoring the pain the movement caused. You won't lose me. I promise. You can't promise that. Then I promise to fight. To always fight to come back to you. She raised her head, looking at him with those green eyes that had become his whole world. Why Basilin on? You know why. Say it. I love you, Margaret. Not as a partner or a convenience. I love you. She was crying harder now, but smiling too. You impossible man. I've loved you since December when you held my hand during that blizzard and told me storms pass. He pulled her down and kissed her properly for the first time since their wedding. It was awkward with his injuries, sweet with tears, and perfect in its imperfection. We're a pair of fools, Margaret said when they broke apart. Married 7 months and just now admitting love. Better late than never. Much better. Recovery was slow. The head injury had affected his balance, compounding his existing mobility issues. But Margaret was patient, creating new exercises, pushing when he needed pushing, allowing rest when he needed rest. You're a tyrant, he complained after a particularly grueling session. I'm your wife, she corrected, and I intend to keep you functional for a very long time. How long? Forever, if possible. Their relationship had transformed. The careful distance they'd maintained evaporated. Margaret moved her things down from the loft, sharing his bed now as wife in truth. They learned each other in new ways. How Margaret curved into him while sleeping, how Daniel woke early just to watch her face in the dawn light. The nightmares didn't stop, but they lessened. When they came, Margaret was there no longer in a chair, but beside him, her presence a more powerful ward than any medicine. One night in July, a different nightmare woke them. Margaret thrashing, crying out a name, Thomas. Daniel held her as she'd held him so many times. When she calmed, she told him what she'd never told anyone. I was there when Thomas died. Not on the battlefield, but after. They brought him to the hospital where I was volunteering. He was gut shot, suffering terribly. He begged me to end it, to give him enough morphine to sleep forever. And God help me, I did. Daniel said nothing, just held her tighter. I killed my husband, Daniel. I murdered him. You showed mercy. That's different. Is it? I've never been sure. The other nurses knew but said nothing. Professional courtesy, but I've carried it every day since. And now I think maybe Thomas would forgive me. Maybe he'd want me to be happy, to live the life he couldn't. I think you're right. They lay in comfortable silence, two damaged souls, finding peace in shared understanding. August brought unexpected visitors. A wagon approached one afternoon carrying a well-dressed couple. Daniel recognized Margaret's sister from her description. Same auburn hair, but styled elaborately, same green eyes, but harder. Catherine, Margaret said flatly, what are you doing here? I came to see if you were actually alive. Your letters have been sparse. The man was introduced as Catherine's husband, a prosperous Boston merchant named Harold Fitzgerald. They looked around the simple cabin with barely concealed disdain. This is where you live, Catherine asked. This is my home, Margaret corrected. You could come back with us. Harold has connections at the hospital. You could resume nursing life properly. I am living properly. Catherine's gaze fell on Daniel, taking in his obvious injuries, his rough clothing. This is what you chose over civilization. This is who I chose, Margaret said firmly. My husband, my life, my choice. You're wasting yourself out here. Your skills, your education, are being used exactly as I choose to use them. The visit was brief and tense. As they prepared to leave, Catherine pulled Margaret aside. He's using you. For nursing, for housekeeping, for love, Margaret interrupted. Something you wouldn't understand. Love, Margaret, you buried love with Thomas. No, I buried Thomas with Thomas. Love I found here. After they left, Margaret stood rigid on the porch. Daniel approached carefully. You could have gone with them. She turned on him, eyes flashing. Don't you dare. Don't you dare suggest I would leave. I'm just saying, well, don't. This is my home. You are my husband. That's the end of it. He pulled her into his arms. I'm sorry, sometimes I wonder what you're doing with a broken down soldier in the middle of nowhere. Living, she said simply, for the first time in years, truly living. That night, she showed him a letter she'd been writing. It was to a nursing journal describing treatment methods for veterans with chronic pain. She'd been documenting Daniel's exercises, his progress creating a methodology that could help others. You've been studying me, helping you, and hopefully helping others like you. With your permission, I'd like to submit this for publication. He read through her careful notes, the compassionate but clinical descriptions of his struggles and victories. You make me sound heroic. You are heroic. Every day you choose to keep going, to push through pain, to build something here. That's heroism. Then you're heroic too. We're a heroic pair. The article was published that fall. Letters began arriving from other nurses, doctors, even veterans themselves asking for more information. Margaret corresponded with them all, sharing knowledge, building a network of healing that stretched far beyond their Wyoming cabin. Winter came again, but this time they were ready. Supplies laid in animal-sheltered wood stacked high. When the first blizzard hit, they watched from the warmth of their cabin with something approaching fondness. Remember last year, Margaret asked. I was terrified. And now I know we can survive anything, together. On the anniversary of Margaret's arrival, Daniel presented her with a gift. It was a simple gold locket bought from a traveling merchant. It's not much, he began, but she stopped him with a kiss. It's perfect. Inside was a photograph he'd had taken in town, the two of them standing before their cabin, Margaret's hand on his arm, both looking at the camera with expressions of quiet contentment. For when you need to remember, he said. I never forget. Not for a moment. That night, as they lay together listening to the wind howl outside, Margaret spoke into the darkness. Daniel, I'm pregnant. He sat up so quickly his bad leg protested. But you said, the doctor said, doctors can be wrong. I'm 2 months along, maybe 3. Margaret. He couldn't say more, overwhelmed by joy and terror in equal measure. Are you happy? Happy doesn't begin to cover it. But Margaret, the nearest doctor, is in Cheyenne. If something goes wrong, nothing will go wrong. I've delivered dozens of babies. I know what to do. You can't deliver your own baby. Then you'll have to help me. The thought was terrifying, but looking at her face radiant with joy, he pushed the fear aside. Then I'll help you. Spring brought new life in abundance. The ranch thrived, calves and foals arriving healthy. Margaret's garden exploded with growth, and her belly grew round with promise. She worked until the last possible moment, adapting as her body changed. Daniel watched with a mixture of awe and anxiety, trying to take on more work to spare her. I'm pregnant, not invalid, she reminded him repeatedly. You're carrying our child. You are miraculous. June 20th, the summer solstice, Margaret went into labor. It was long, difficult, and Daniel had never been more terrified. But Margaret was calm, talking him through what needed to be done, even as she struggled through contractions. When their daughter finally arrived, screaming and perfect, Daniel wept unashamedly. She's beautiful, Margaret whispered, exhausted but glowing. She looks like you. Poor child. Lucky child. They named her Sarah Hope McKay. Sarah for the hope of new life, hope for what she represented. The future neither had believed they'd have. And as Daniel held his daughter for the first time, watching Margaret sleep after her ordeal, he thought about the journey that had brought them here. 2 broken people connected by letters and loneliness who'd found healing in each other's brokenness. The war had taken so much from both of them, innocence, health, loved ones. But here in this simple cabin on the Wyoming plains, they'd built something new from the ruins. Not a replacement for what was lost, but something different, something theirs. Margaret stirred, reaching for him. You're thinking too loud. Just counting blessings. What number are you on? I lost count around the time you agreed to marry me. She smiled, that transformative expression he had first seen by firelight. We've come a long way from those first letters. Dear Mr. McKay, he quoted from memory, your advertisement intrigues me. Dear Mrs. O'Brien, she responded, I hope I may prove worthy of your interest. You have, they said together, then laughed, waking Sarah, who immediately demanded feeding. As Margaret nursed their daughter, Daniel sat beside them, his hand on Margaret's shoulder. Outside, the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Inside, their small family was complete, bound together by choice, strengthened by struggle, and sustained by love. The letters that had brought them together sat in a box on the shelf tied with ribbon. Someday they'd show them to Sarah, tell her how her parents found each other across miles and grief, how two people who'd lost everything discovered that together they had everything they needed. But for now, they simply lived day by day, season by season, building a life from love and letters in the vast Wyoming wilderness they called home. Years later, when Sarah was old enough to understand, she asked her mother how she knew father was the right choice from just his letters. Margaret thought for a moment, then said, "He asked for patience and kindness, nothing more. A man who knows those are the most important things is a man worth taking a chance on." And father, how did he know? Daniel, listening from his chair by the fire, answered. She wrote about healing coming from unexpected places. I knew then she understood that broken doesn't mean worthless. Sarah, with the wisdom of youth, simply nodded. So you healed each other. Her parents exchanged glances over her head, a lifetime of shared understanding in that look. We did, they said together. We absolutely did.